Last night, a number of us from this chamber, many of us from across the country, gathered for a remarkable evening to support and honor an organization called Sandy Hook Promise, an organization created in the wake of the horrific, unspeakable tragedy in Newtown that involved a mass murder, 20 beautiful, innocent children and 6th grade educators. Sandy Hook Promise was created to make some good come of this horrific evil, to protect children against violence and prevent more gun violence around the country, to advance the cause of mental health and wellness, and to make sure that no one is alone. No one eats alone, no one suffers alone, no one endures mental illness alone. Sandy Hook Promise is a wonderful, inspiring organization, and I was proud to serve as the co-chairman of this event, along with my great colleague, Chris Murphy, who has been a partner in efforts to stop gun violence in this chamber and in Connecticut and around the country. And I was proud also that the dinner and evening honored 2 of our colleagues, Senator Debbie Stabenow, a wonderful friend and distinguished member of this body from Michigan, and Pat Toomey, our friend from Pennsylvania, who added his name and the weight of his support to a measure just last session seeking to protect children against gun violence by imposing universal background check. This evening was designed to honor our 2 colleagues, but it really was so inspiring to me to hear from Nicole Hockley and Mark Barden and Bill Sherlock, whose lives were transformed and changed forever on that horrific day. And I will never forget that day. Going to the firehouse in Sandy Hook, seeing the grief and pain experienced by those families who learned for the first time that their beautiful children would not be coming home that night, the searing memory of their faces and voices will be with me forever. And their courage and strength in the wake of that tragedy will inspire me forever. And inspired many of our colleagues to vote for the common sense, sensible measures that Senator Toomey and Senator Manchin of West Virginia helped to spearhead, a bipartisan package of measures that was advanced so ably and advocated by them and many of us tirelessly in those days before the vote. And there was a majority of senators who voted in favor of that package of measures. Unfortunately, that majority did not reach 60 votes. But last night was a time to renew and redouble our efforts to prevent gun violence and to take positive, constructive, common sense, sensible steps to help prevent it around the country. At the very outset of the evening, I asked for a moment of silence. Both Senator Murphy and I joined in requesting a moment of silence to honor the loved ones and families in Charleston, South Carolina. Our hearts and prayers go out now to them, as they have since that unimaginable tragedy, the violation not only of human life, but the sanctity of a place of worship. Just as Newtown involved the violation of a place we regard as among the safest, our schoolhouse, killing our school children. And when we finish that moment of silence, I'm sure all of us retain the grief and pain. We in Connecticut know and understand that grief and pain and outrage because we remember that day when we felt it in the same way that the people of Charleston felt it when 9 people were killed and their families left with holes in their hearts, just as we were left on that day in Newtown. But the message of last night was not one of despair or desperation. It was one of hope and energy. And that message came from Nicole Hockley and Mark Barton and Bill Sherlock, and through them from the families of Sandy Hook, who came here to Washington and have continued their work through Sandy Hook Promise and other organizations to make some good come of that evil. And we can do it. We can make sure that this country does more than grieve and remember, but redouble its commitment as a nation to make our nation safer and better. And not just for those 9 innocent people in a church in Charleston or 26 innocent people in a schoolhouse in Sandy Hook, but for the 11,000 people every year on the streets of Hartford and New Haven and Stamford, in our rural and suburban communities, on our military bases, throughout our country. 11,000 people who die every year from gun violence. We can be sure that we will never eliminate all gun violence. We will never stop all the deaths and killing. But we can save lives. And that is what the families of Newtown said to me in the wake of their tragedy. And that is what I hope our nation will say to itself in the wake of the Charleston tragedy. We will never stop all evil, but we can take a stand and stop some of it. I recalled last night the conversation that I had with one of the moms at the funeral of her child when I approached her, and I said, somewhat apprehensively, you know, when you're ready, I'd like to talk to you about what we can do together to stop gun violence in this country when you're ready. And she said, tears in her eyes, I'm ready now. That was the spirit that the families of Newtown brought to our capital. That is the spirit that I hope we can honor with action, not just words on the floor of the Senate or in the eulogies that will be given tomorrow, but to make for those victims of Charleston and Newtown and the 11,000 people who die needlessly and senselessly every year from gun violence an answer to the question that all of us have: what can we do? What can we do to stop gun violence? And there are some answers: background checks, ban on illegal trafficking, an end to straw purchases, mental health initiatives, school safety. Those are some, and we should think of others and work together, just as Sandy Hook Promise has done, regardless of party, part of the country, race or religion, regardless of where we live or what our interest is, because we have a common shared interest in making our nation safer and better. And that's why honoring both Pat Toomey and Debbie Stabenow was so meaningful, because they have given so much in their courage and leadership to making our nation safer and better. The killer in Charleston was not just a murderer, he was a domestic terrorist. He meant to terrify, not just kill. He meant to start a race war. He was a racist and a white supremacist, and rightly has been regarded as someone who came to that church not just to target innocent worshipers, but an entire community. He targeted the town of Charleston, the state of South Carolina, our nation, and his message was not about hate for specific individuals, it was hate for an entire race. We should recognize domestic terrorism and racism for what it is. We're not the only country with racists, but we are a country with a uniquely high number of gun violence incidents. The shooting in Charleston was a physical manifestation of ideas that go beyond this murder. And to prevent future shootings, we must understand and undercut the ideas that he killed so that he could advance. We need to call this problem for what it is and understand it and fight it. Hate-inspired domestic terrorism is an evil all itself. But we can make progress against gun violence. We know we can, just as surely as 10 days ago, no one thought that the Confederate flag on state grounds in South Carolina would ever be removed. No one ever thought, plausibly, that the governor of South Carolina would ever advocate it. And now that has happened, just as common sense, sensible measures against gun violence can happen. We can prevail. Nobody thought before Ronald Reagan was almost assassinated and Jim Brady was paralyzed that the Brady bill would ever be passed. In fact, it took 10 years. So we are here in a marathon, not a sprint. We are here for the long haul. We are not going away, not giving up, not abandoning this fight, not surrendering to the forces of domestic terrorism or racial hatred or gun violence. We are better than that as a nation. And so, as we leave and go back home for this recess, I hope that we will not only share the grief and pain of those brave and courageous families in South Carolina who were so heroic in the face of evil, but resolve that we will redouble our efforts to raise awareness, to organize people who are of goodwill and want to stop gun violence and who need to be heard, because the vast majority of the American people want us to take common sense, sensible measures to make America safer and better. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.